Hey guys, tonight we're trading in the crashing waves and the clang of steel for something a little cozier. We're peeling back the layers of legend from those famously fierce Norse seafarers, the Vikings, to peek into what they did when they weren't, you know, out Vikinging. Imagine a grizzled warrior, fresh from a long voyage, finally home. What does he do? Sharpen his axe some more. Well, maybe. But tonight, we're diving into the surprisingly diverse and sometimes downright unusual pastimes they enjoyed, right in their own homes and communities. Forget the horned helmets for a moment. We'll get to why that's mostly a myth later. And picture instead firelight, laughter, and perhaps even a board game. Imagine trying to assemble a piece of flat pack IKEA furniture after a long day of, say, discovering North America. Yeah, like even Vikings probably had their limits and just wanted to chill with a good story or a competitive game of, well, we'll get to that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know down in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always find it fascinating to see our global community. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stepping back in time, roughly to the period between the late 8th and mid 11th centuries, the era we call the Viking Age. The very word Viking often conjures up images of fearsome, axe-wielding raiders, their longships slicing through misty seas, their battle cries echoing across terrified shores. And while that's certainly a part of their story, it's far from the whole picture. These Scandinavians, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, were also farmers, traders, explorers of incredible skill, meticulous craftsmen, and most importantly for our journey tonight, people with homes, families, and a need for leisure and social connection, just like anyone else. Their idea of a relaxing hobby might still involve activities that seem a bit intense by our standards, maybe even involving a few sharp objects here and there. But hey, different strokes for different seafaring folks. When the raiding season was over, or when the trading ships were safely harbored for the winter, what did these warriors do to unwind? How did they pass the long, dark Scandinavian nights? It certainly wasn't all brooding and sharpening blades, though a well-maintained axe was undoubtedly a point of pride. Their pastimes were often a reflection of their culture, valuing strength, skill, cleverness, storytelling, and strong community bonds. Many of their leisure activities were social, designed to be enjoyed in the company of kith and kin, often within the smoky warmth of their iconic longhouses. Some activities helped hone practical skills, while others were purely for entertainment, for laughter, and for the sheer joy of competition or creation. One of the first things we need to do is gently set aside that popular image of Vikings charging into battle with massive horned helmets. Our mainstream historical fact for this evening is that the widespread depiction of Vikings wearing horned helmets is largely a 19th century romantic invention, popularized by costume designers for operas like Wagner's Der Ring der Nibelungen. Actual Viking Age helmets that have been discovered, like the Gjermundbu helmet from Norway, were typically much simpler, rounded or conical iron caps, sometimes with a spectacle-like guard for the eyes and nose, but definitely no impractical, easily grabbed horns. So, picture your Viking at home, having hung up his sensible unhorned helmet for the evening. Now, for a quirky tidbit that hints at their domestic side, archaeological digs at Viking Age sites have unearthed a surprising number of personal grooming items. We're talking combs often beautifully carved from bone or antler, tweezers, ear spoons, yes, for cleaning ears, and even remnants of what might have been soaps. This suggests that Vikings, both men and women, were actually quite concerned with their hygiene and appearance, perhaps more so than many other European cultures of the same period. So, part of their at-home time might have been dedicated to a bit of sprucing up. Not exactly a pastime, but indicative of a life beyond constant grime and battle. Historians still debate the extent to which the Viking identity was a full-time profession versus a seasonal activity for many individuals who were primarily farmers or traders. For some, going Viking, participating in raids or long-distance trade expeditions, might have been something they did for a few months a year, returning to their farms and families for the remainder. This perspective really opens up the importance of their home life and the pastimes that filled the many months when they weren't at sea. If your main gig is farming, you're going to need some solid R&R when the harvest is in, especially if your summer vacation involved sailing to England and negotiating for silver. So, over the next while, that we're going to push past the warrior stereotype, step inside their homes, and explore the games they played, the stories they told, the music they made, and the ways they simply enjoyed being human. Far from the fury of the raid. You think your family game night gets competitive? Wait till you hear about Viking boasting contests. Spilling the mead was often the least of your worries if you couldn't back up your big talk. Let's discover the unusual, the unexpected, and the surprisingly familiar ways these Norsemen and women unwound. Before we delve into the specific games and revelries, let's set the scene. Where did all this Viking R&R take place more often than not? The heart of domestic life, and therefore the primary stage for their at-home pastimes, was the longhouse. You're stepping into one now, pushing aside a heavy wooden door or a thick animal hide. And the first things that strike you are the dim, smoky atmosphere, the earthy smell of wood smoke, animals, and unwashed Vikings, though, remember, they did like their combs. And the surprising length of the building, the Viking age. Longhouse, or langhus, was exactly that long. These structures could vary in size, from modest farm dwellings to the truly massive halls of powerful chieftains, some reaching lengths of over 50, even 80 meters. That's longer than an Olympic swimming pool. Our mainstream historical fact is that these longhouses were typically built with timber frames, often with walls made of wattle and daub-woven branches covered in clay or mud or turf, and topped with a thatched or turf roof. They were often slightly curved, like a ship's hull turned upside down, a shape that provided structural stability against the harsh Scandinavian weather. You can almost feel the sturdy timbers around you. Imagine the wind howling outside while inside. Life continues, sheltered and relatively warm. And inside, the layout was generally quite simple, but effective. A central aisle usually ran the length of the building, and this is where the all-important hearth, or a series of fire pits, would be located. There were no chimneys as we know them. Smoke would find its way out through a hole in the roof or vents under the eaves. This, of course, meant the interior was perpetually smoky, good for curing meat hung from the rafters, less good for anyone with asthma, but it added to the characteristic atmosphere. Is that smoke in your eyes? Are you just emotionally moved by my amazing saga? A Viking skald might quip. Along the sides of this central aisle were raised wooden platforms or benches, running the length of the walls. These were the multi-purpose zones by day. They served as seating areas and workspaces. By night, with the addition of furs and woolen blankets, they became sleeping quarters. Families would often live together in these communal spaces, sometimes with their livestock housed in a separate section at one end of the longhouse, especially during the harsh winters. Yes, you heard that right. Your roommate might occasionally be a cow. Good for extra warmth. Perhaps. But imagine the aroma on a still night. Honey, did you leave the cow door open again? It smells like a petting zoo in here, and not in a charming way. This communal living was a key aspect of Viking society, and the longhouse was its focal point. It was here that families ate together, worked on crafts, told stories, and, crucially for our exploration, engaged in their various pastimes. The central hearth was more than just a source of heat and light. It was the social heart of the home. Around its flickering flames, much of Viking leisure would unfold. You can picture the scene: the day's work on the farm or at the forge is done. The evening meal probably some kind of stew, or pottage, with bread and perhaps some dried fish or meat has been eaten. The dim light of the fire and perhaps a few oil lamps casts long, dancing shadows on the timber walls. This is the time for relaxation, for connection, for entertainment. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some exceptionally large longhouses, like the reconstructed one at Lofeter Viking Museum in Borg, Norway based on an actual chieftain's hall, were so grand they likely served not just as homes but as significant political and social centers. These great halls would have hosted large feasts, religious ceremonies, and gatherings of warriors and local dignitaries. The pastimes here might be on a grander scale, with more participants and perhaps higher stakes. But the underlying principles of socializing, competing, and storytelling would remain. Imagine the pressure of a board game when your chieftain is watching, and the prize is not just bragging rights, but maybe an extra helping of roast boar. Archaeologists still debate the exact internal divisions and uses of space within different types of longhouses, based on post hole patterns, hearth placements, and artifact distribution. While the general layout is understood, the specific allocation of areas for different activities, or for individuals of varying status within the household, can be a complex puzzle to piece together. Were there designated game corners or storytelling spots? Probably not formally key to them, but human nature suggests people would gravitate to certain areas for certain activities. So, as you settle into this smoky, fire-lit interior, surrounded by the sounds and smells of Viking domestic life, remember that this longhouse is more than just a building. It's a microcosm of their world, a place of work, rest, family, and community. It's the crucible where Viking culture was lived and passed down, and it's the primary setting for the unusual pastimes we're about to explore. The very architecture and atmosphere of the longhouse shaped how these warriors and their families unwound, making their leisure activities deeply intertwined with the rhythms of their home life. Now that we're comfortably settled in the smoky ambiance of the Viking longhouse, let's turn to one of the most central and vibrant pastimes that took place within its walls: feasting. For the Vikings, a feast was far more than just a big meal. It was a cornerstone of social life, a way to display wealth and generosity, forge alliances, celebrate victories, honor the gods, and, of course, have a rollicking good time. And these feasts weren't quiet, polite affairs. They were boisterous, often lengthy, and came with their own unique forms of entertainment, including the ever-popular and sometimes perilous word duels. You're seated on one of those long wooden benches we talked about, perhaps on a plush fur throw if your host is particularly well off. The central hearths are blazing, casting a ruddy glow on the faces around you. The air is thick with the aroma of roasting meat, perhaps pork, goat, or even horse, depending on the occasion and availability, along with the smell of boiling cauldrons of stew, freshly baked bread, and, of course, overflowing horns and beakers of drink. This is our mainstream historical fact. Feasting played a crucial role in Viking society, serving social, political, and religious functions, and often involved the consumption of large quantities of meat, bread, and alcoholic beverages like mead and ale. The drink of choice was often ale, brewed from barley, or the more prestigious mead, a potent honey wine. Wine, imported from southern lands, might also make an appearance at the tables of the wealthy. These beverages weren't just for quenching thirst, they were integral to the feasting experience, loosening tongues and fueling the general merriment. Drinking horns, sometimes elaborately decorated, were passed around, and to refuse a drink or fail to keep up could be seen as an insult or a sign of weakness. Another horn of mead, Brave Bjorn. Don't be shy, there's plenty more where that came from, unless Leif drank it all already. Leif. But the entertainment wasn't just about stuffing your face and getting pleasantly buzzed. The Vikings loved a good verbal contest. As the mead flowed, so too did the boasts, the witty insults, and the challenges. This brings us to the manjafnader, or man-matching, a formal contest of boasting and insult, and the related senna, a ritualized exchange of taunts and accusations, often poetic in form. Imagine two warriors, or even a warrior and a god as seen in some Eddic poems like the Lokasenna, where Loki insults all the other gods at a feast, standing up in the hall, trading increasingly elaborate and often hilariously cutting remarks about each other's bravery, lineage, sexual prowess, or lack thereof. The audience would roar with laughter and approval at a particularly clever jibe or a well-defended boast. It was like a poetry slam crossed with a roast battle. Viking style. Oh, you think your raid on Lindisfarne was impressive? I once single-handedly wrestled a sea serpent that had swallowed a chieftain's prize pig. And I got the pig back. Mostly intact. A hush would fall, then either cheers or a cutting rebuttal. This wasn't always just harmless fun. Though, reputations were on the line. A poorly received boast or an undefended insult could lead to a serious loss of face, and in a society that prized honor above almost all else, that was a big deal. Sometimes these verbal duels could even escalate into actual physical violence if tempers flared too high and the mead was particularly strong. So, while it was a pastime, it was one with an edge. It required wit, a quick mind, a strong command of poetic language, and a good memory for past deeds both your own and your opponent's. Our quirky tidbit is that sometimes these boasting contests or verbal duels had formal judges, or the host of the feast might declare a winner. The prize might simply be heightened status and the admiration of one's peers, but that was a currency highly valued in Viking society. It was a way for warriors to establish their pecking order and build their renown without necessarily having to draw swords, though the threat of that was sometimes an undercurrent. It's like an ancient rap battle where your lyrical skills could earn you serious street cred, or in this case, longhouse cred. Archaeologists and historians still debate the exact frequency and formality of events like the Senna in everyday longhouse life versus their more stylized portrayal in heroic poetry and sagas. Were these highly structured, almost ritualistic events reserved for specific occasions, or were more informal boasting and verbal sparring a common feature of any lively feast? The sagas are full of such exchanges, suggesting they were a recognized and important part of the culture. But how much of that is literary embellishment versus a reflection of daily reality is a perennial question. So, as the fire crackles and the drinking horns are refilled, you can appreciate that a Viking feast was a multi-sensory experience, a vibrant tapestry of food, drink, camaraderie, and sharp-witted entertainment. It was a place to affirm bonds, celebrate life, and verbally joust with your comrades in arms and rivals. These word duels, fueled by mead and a desire for glory, were a key way Vikings unwound, sharpened their wits, and navigated the complex social dynamics of their world, all within the boisterous, smoky confines of the longhouse. Just be careful whose boast you challenge unless you're very sure of your own verbal and perhaps physical defenses. After the boisterous feasting, the rounds of mead, and the sharp-tongued verbal duels, what other pastimes might you find occupying the minds and hands of Vikings in their longhouses as the embers of the central hearth glowed and the night deepened? Out might come the game boards. The Vikings, for all their fierce warrior reputation, were avid players of strategic board games, finding in them a way to sharpen their minds, pass the long hours, and engage in a more contemplative form of competition. You can almost see a couple of warriors, their earlier boasts now set aside, hunched over a carved wooden board, brows furrowed in concentration. Our mainstream historical fact is that board games were a popular form of leisure in the Viking Age, with the most well-known being a family of games collectively referred to as tafel, meaning table or board, cognate with the German Tafeling. The most famous variant we know of is Nefatafel, often translated as King's Table. Archaeological excavations have unearthed numerous game boards and playing pieces made from wood, bone, antler, stone, amber, or even glass from Viking settlements across Scandinavia, Britain, and Ireland. These weren't just idle diversions, they were clearly a significant part of their material culture and daily life. Hnefatafl was an asymmetrical strategy game, which makes it particularly interesting. It wasn't like chess where both sides have equal forces. Instead, one player had a king piece, the hnefi or fist, referring to the king piece positioned in the center of the board, protected by a small band of defenders. The other player had a larger force of attackers, typically outnumbering the defenders 2-1, positioned around the edges of the board. The objective for the king's side was to get the king piece safely to one of the corner squares or sometimes edge squares, depending on the rule variant. The objective for the attackers was to capture the king by surrounding him on 4 sides or sometimes 2 if he was against a corner or edge. All pieces generally moved like rooks in chess, any number of unoccupied squares horizontally or vertically. It was a game of siege and escape, attack and defense, requiring considerable foresight and tactical thinking. Ha, Ragnar, you thought your king was safe. But my attackers have formed a cunning pincer movement. Your hnefi is about to become a nefi sandwich. The boards themselves could range from simple grids scratched onto a piece of wood or stone to more elaborate, finely crafted items. Playing pieces, too. Varied from simple pebbles or wooden pegs to intricately carved figures. The very act of making these game sets could have been a pastime in itself, as we'll explore later when we talk about craftsmanship. Imagine a warrior carefully whittling his own set of Hnefatafl pieces during a long sea voyage, or a craftsman back home creating a beautiful board as a gift for a chieftain. Now for a quirky tidbit. While Hnefatafl is the most famous, there were likely other board games played by the Vikings. Another game mentioned in some sagas is Nidavel or Hnefatafl, which some scholars speculate might have been a more complex dice and board game, perhaps involving elements of both strategy and luck, or even reflecting cosmological beliefs. The exact rules for Nidavel are even more obscure than those for Hnefatafl, but its mention suggests a wider gaming culture than just one type of Viking chess. It's like knowing that people today play not just chess, but also Monopoly, Scrabble, and 1,000 other board games. The Vikings probably had their own range of tabletop diversions. Anyone fancy a game of Serpent Pit and Ladder tonight, or perhaps Raid the Monastery Tycoon? Archaeologists and game historians still debate the precise rules and regional variations of Tafel games, as no complete, unambiguous rule set has survived from the Viking Age itself. Reconstructions of Hnefatafl rules are based on later medieval accounts from Lapland, where a related game called Tablet survived, Wales Talbword, and Ireland Fidchel, combined with archaeological finds and clues from the sagas. This means there's still some guesswork involved, and you might find different, authentic Hnefatafl rule sets if you look them up today. It's a bit like trying to reconstruct the rules of an ancient sport based only on a few surviving balls and some epic poems about famous matches. You get the general idea, but the exact offside rule remains elusive. Playing these games wasn't just about killing time. For a warrior society, Hnefatafl offered a perfect way to practice strategic thinking, to learn about defense, attack, and the importance of protecting a key asset, the king. It mirrored the realities of Viking Age warfare in a miniaturized, abstract form. Success required patience, planning, and the ability to anticipate your opponent's moves, all valuable skills on the battlefield. You can imagine the intense, quiet concentration around a game board, a stark contrast to the boisterous feasting, but no less engaging. Losing a game might not have the same social sting as losing a verbal duel, but the desire to win, to outthink your opponent, would have been just as strong. These games were a mental gymnasium, keeping Viking minds as sharp as their axes, even in the depths of a long winter's night. While strategic board games like Hnefatafl appealed to the Viking love of tactics and outmaneuvering an opponent, not every evening called for such intense mental exertion. Sometimes, what you craved was a simpler pleasure, a bit of lighthearted fun, perhaps with a dash of luck and the thrill of a small wager. For these moments, the Vikings turned to dice. These small, unassuming objects, found in numerous archaeological contexts, tell us that games of chance were another popular way for warriors and their families to unwind and test their fortunes. You're still in the longhouse. Perhaps the Nefertafel board has been put away, or maybe a different group is gathering in another corner. You hear the characteristic rattle and clatter of dice being thrown, followed by groans or cheers. This is our mainstream historical fact. Dice games were common in the Viking Age, with dice made from bone, antler, walrus ivory, or wood being frequently discovered by archaeologists in graves and settlement sites. These dice were typically six-sided, much like modern dice. Though their pips the dots were not always arranged and the opposite sides add to 7 pattern we're used to today. The games played with these dice were likely quite varied, ranging from simple highest roll wins affairs to more complex rule sets that have unfortunately not survived in detail. We can imagine Vikings gathering around a smoothed piece of wood or a stretched animal hide, taking turns to cast the dice. Perhaps they played for small stakes, a bit of silver, a drinking horn, a favor owed, gambling, in moderation or sometimes not. Seems to be a near universal human pastime. And the Vikings were no exception. All right, Astrid, one more roll. If I get a 6, you owe me that shiny bit of amber you found. If not, I'll owe you my second best whetstone. Deal? The sagas occasionally mention dice playing, sometimes in the context of chieftains passing the time, or even as a point of contention that escalates into something more serious, as things often did in the Viking world if honor or too much mead was involved. But mostly, it would have been a relaxed way to socialize and enjoy a bit of friendly competition where luck, rather than skill, was the primary arbiter. It's a different kind of thrill from a strategy game, the anticipation of the roll, the collective holding of breath, the sudden outcome decided by the capricious fall of the dice. It's the Viking equivalent of a casual poker night or a game of Yahtzee, without the little plastic cup. Probably. Our quirky tidbit is that some Viking Age dice are not perfectly cubical or have their pips arranged in unusual ways. Some are elongated, some have irregularly sized faces, and the numbering can be idiosyncratic. This might suggest that fairness in dice, as we understand it with precision-machined casino dice, wasn't always the primary concern, or perhaps that different types of dice were used for different games with different odds. It could also just be a result of them being handmade. Imagine playing with a die that's clearly weighted to land on 6 more often. Suspiciously lucky again. Eric. The die of yours seems to have a mind of its own, and it always seems to favor your side of the board. Let me inspect that walrus tusk marvel. Archaeologists and scholars still debate the specific rules of the dice games played by the Vikings and the extent to which gambling was a socially acceptable or problematic behavior. While finds of dice are common, detailed instructions for the games themselves are lacking. Much like with Nefertafel, we have to infer from the context of the finds, comparisons with other cultures, and scant references in literature. Were there Viking versions of popular Roman dice games? Or did they have their own unique creations? And how did they view heavy gambling? The sagas sometimes portray excessive gambling negatively, leading to ruin and conflict, suggesting that while games of chance were enjoyed, there were probably social norms about keeping it within reasonable bounds, at least most of the time. Lost your prize sheep in a dice game? Sven, your wife is not going to be happy. You should stick to boasting contests, at least those are free. Mostly, the simplicity of dice games made them incredibly versatile. They could be played anywhere by almost anyone, with minimal equipment. A couple of dice and a flat surface were all you needed. This made them an ideal pastime for long winter evenings in the longhouse, for whiling away time on a trading voyage if the seas were calm enough, or even for a quick bit of fun during a break from farm work. They provided a welcome contrast to the more physically demanding or mentally taxing aspects of Viking life. It was a chance to let fate take the wheel for a bit, to laugh at misfortune, to celebrate a lucky roll, and to enjoy the simple camaraderie of shared play. The rattle of bone dice on a wooden table would have been another familiar, comforting sound in the tapestry of Viking domestic life. As the dice are put away and the longhouse settles into a deeper quiet, another, perhaps more profound form of entertainment would often take center stage storytelling. In a world without television, internet, or even widespread literacy for personal reading, the power of the spoken word was immense. The Vikings were master storytellers and avid listeners, and their sagas, myths, and skaldic poetry formed the vibrant core of their cultural heritage and a beloved evening pastime. You can almost feel the hush fall over the gathered household as a skilled storyteller begins to weave their verbal magic, the firelight dancing on their expressive face. This is our mainstream historical fact. The Viking Age had a rich oral tradition, which included the recounting of heroic sagas, prose narratives, often dealing with historical figures, family histories, or legendary heroes, mythological tales about their gods and goddesses like Odin, Thor, Freya, and the trickster Loki, and the performance of complex skaldic poetry by trained poets known as skalds. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were history, genealogy, moral instruction, and a way of understanding the cosmos, all rolled into one. Imagine a long winter evening. Outside, the wind howls and the snow piles deep. Inside the longhouse, warmed by the fire and the presence of family and companions, a respected elder or a traveling skald clears their throat. All eyes turn towards them. They might begin to recount the adventures of a famous ancestor, a tale of bravery in battle, a cunning trick played on a rival, or a perilous voyage to distant lands. Or perhaps they would delve into the realm of the gods, telling of Thor's mighty hammer, Mjolnir, Odin's quest for wisdom, or the intricate web of fate woven by the Norns. These sagas, often long and detailed, would be listened to with rapt attention, passed down through generations, perhaps with slight variations and embellishments creeping in with each telling, like a cherished family recipe. And then, children. Ragnar Lothbrok, finding himself in a pit of vipers, composed his death song, declaring he would die laughing, a true Viking. That one? Skaldic poetry was a particularly high art form. Skalds were professional poets, often attached to the courts of kings and chieftains, who composed intricate verses praising their patrons' deeds, commemorating victories, or mourning losses. Their poetry was characterized by complex meters like drottgevet, strict rules of alliteration and internal rhyme, and the extensive use of kennings, metaphorical compound expressions, like whale road for the sea or battle sweat for blood. Reciting or composing skaldic verse was a display of immense verbal skill and learning. It wasn't light listening, it was a sophisticated intellectual exercise, appreciated for its artistry and cleverness. You can picture a chieftain nodding in approval as his skald masterfully navigates the complex wordplay, perhaps rewarding him with a gold arm ring for a particularly brilliant kenning. Calling my sword, wound hoe. Genius, have another drink. Poet. Our quirky tidbit is that storytelling sessions could sometimes be interactive. Listeners might ask questions, offer their own related anecdotes, or even challenge aspects of a tale if they knew a different version. It wasn't always a passive experience. Furthermore, the performance itself was key. A good storyteller wouldn't just recite words. They would use gestures, vocal inflections, and dramatic pauses to bring the characters and events to life, captivating their audience and transporting them to other times and places. It was live theater, played out in the intimate setting of the longhouse. Historians and literary scholars still debate the exact processes of transmission for the sagas, and Eddic poems the primary sources for Norse mythology, most of which were only written down centuries after the Viking Age. Primarily in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries, how much did they change from their original oral forms? To what extent were they influenced by Christian scribes or later literary conventions? While the written versions we have are undoubtedly colored by the time of their recording, They are believed to preserve a substantial core of authentic Viking Age oral tradition, offering invaluable insights into their worldview, values, and indeed their forms of entertainment. It's like trying to reconstruct an original hit song based on several later cover versions. You can get the melody and lyrics, but some of the original instrumentation and performance nuances might be lost or altered. For the Vikings at home, these evenings of storytelling were more than just a way to pass the time. They were a vital connection to their past, a reinforcement of their cultural identity, and a source of inspiration and moral guidance. The heroes of the sagas provided role models and cautionary tales. The myths explained the workings of the world, and the poetry celebrated the values of courage, honor, loyalty, and cunning. As the fire burned low and the tales concluded, the listeners would carry those stories in their hearts. Their imagination sparked, their understanding of what it meant to be Norse deepened by the power of the spoken word. While the spoken word, in the form of sagas and skaldic poetry, held a place of immense honor in the Viking longhouse, it wasn't the only sound that filled the evenings. Music, too, played its part in their domestic leisure, providing a different kind of emotional expression and communal enjoyment. Though perhaps not as central or as well documented as their literary traditions, evidence from archaeological finds, saga references, and artistic depictions shows that the Vikings had musical instruments and likely used them for song, dance, and general merrymaking. You can almost hear the faint, plaintive notes of a lyre or the breathy tones of a flute, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the murmur of conversation. Our mainstream historical fact is that several types of musical instruments are known from the Viking Age, primarily through archaeological discoveries. These include stringed instruments like the lyre, a small, U-shaped harp-like instrument, and perhaps an early form of fiddle or rebec. Though direct evidence for bowed instruments in the core Viking Age is more debated. Wind instruments found include panpipes, wooden flutes, and pipes made from animal bone or horn. Percussion instruments, like drums or rhythm sticks, are less commonly found but are presumed to have existed, essential as they are for rhythm and dance. These instruments would have provided the soundtrack for various social gatherings and personal moments of reflection. Imagine a quiet evening in the longhouse. Perhaps the epic sagas have been told for the night, and someone picks up a lyre. This instrument, often with 6 or 7 strings made from animal gut, would be plucked or strummed to create simple melodies. The sound would be gentle, perhaps a little melancholic, suitable for accompanying a quiet song or providing a soothing background ambiance. Fragments of wooden lyres, and sometimes just the tuning pegs or bridge pieces, have been found in Viking graves and settlements, like the famous lyre from Birka in Sweden or the earlier Sutton Hoo lyre from Anglo-Saxon England, which shows the shared Germanic musical heritage. Anyone else find it soothing when Olaf plays that little tune about the lonely fjord? A Viking might whisper. Much better than his boasting about that undersized walrus he supposedly caught. Flutes, often carved from the leg bones of sheep or large birds like swans or cranes, would have offered a different timbre, perhaps clearer, more bird-like tones. These could have been used for solo melodies, for signaling, or even in ensemble with other instruments or voices. Panpipes made from a series of short, stopped pipes of graduated length bound together also appear in the archaeological record, offering the ability to play a simple scale of notes. These instruments weren't necessarily for virtuoso performances in a concert hall setting. They were part of the fabric of daily life, accessible and enjoyed by many. Maybe a young shepherd boy would pass the time playing a bone flute while watching his flock, or a woman would hum a lullaby accompanied by the soft strumming of a lyre. Our quirky tidbit is the potential ceremonial or even magical use of some of these instruments. Music in many ancient cultures was not just for entertainment, but also had ritualistic or spiritual significance. The sound of a horn or a drum might be used in religious ceremonies to mark important transitions, or even in an attempt to influence weather or ward off evil spirits. While concrete evidence for this in a specifically Viking domestic pastime context is scarce, it's plausible that music sometimes transcended mere leisure and touched upon the sacred, even in the home. Perhaps certain melodies were believed to have healing properties, or specific songs were sung to invoke good fortune before a journey. Quick, play the No More Sea Monsters jig. We're setting sail tomorrow, and I'm not taking any chances after what happened to poor Sven's uncle. Archaeologists and musicologists still debate the complexity and nature of Viking Age music itself, as no musical notation from that period survives in Scandinavia. We have the instruments, but how exactly were they played? What did their melodies and harmonies sound like? Reconstructions are based on the capabilities of the surviving instruments, comparisons with contemporary musical traditions in other parts of Europe, and later Scandinavian folk music that might preserve echoes of older styles. It's a fascinating field of experimental archaeology, trying to bring the lost sounds of the Viking Age back to life. It's like finding an ancient electric guitar but having no recordings or sheet music. You can figure out how to make sound, but replicating the actual songs is a huge challenge. So, while the sagas stirred the intellect and the spirit with tales of gods and heroes, music would have appealed more directly to the emotions. It could be joyful, mournful, rousing, or soothing. It could accompany dancing, which they almost certainly did, though details are sparse, provide a rhythm for work, or simply offer a pleasant diversion during the long, dark hours. The sounds of these simple instruments, played by the hearth in the Viking longhouse, would have added another layer of warmth and humanity to their often harsh world. A reminder that even the fiercest warriors had a place in their hearts for the simple beauty of a well-played tune or a heartfelt song. While board games sharpened the mind and storytelling enriched the soul, the Vikings, being the physically robust and competitive people they were, also enjoyed pastimes that tested their strength, agility, and endurance. Even at home, or in the immediate vicinity of their settlements, they found ways to engage in friendly, and sometimes not so friendly, physical contests. These weren't just about bragging rights, they were a way to stay fit, hone combat-related skills, and affirm one's place in a society that highly valued physical prowess. You can imagine the young warriors, full of energy even after a day's labor, eager to challenge each other in various feats of strength. Our mainstream historical fact is that various forms of wrestling, known generally as glima, were an extremely popular sport and pastime throughout the Viking Age and beyond in Scandinavia. Glima wasn't just a rough and tumble brawl, it had different styles and rules, some emphasizing strength, others technique and balance. It could be practiced by men and women, though usually not against each other in serious contests. Archaeological finds include objects that some interpret as wrestling stones, or markers for wrestling areas, and the sagas are replete with descriptions of wrestling matches, ranging from friendly bouts at feasts to more serious duels to settle disputes. All right, Finn, you may have outboasted me at the feast, but let's see how you fare on the wrestling green loser mucks out the goat pen for a week. These wrestling matches would often draw eager crowds of spectators from the community. Imagine a clear space outside the longhouse, or perhaps even a designated field. Two combatants, stripped for action, circle each other, looking for an opening. The crowd shouts encouragement or jeers. A successful throw, a skillful takedown, would be met with roars of approval. It was entertainment, yes, but also a serious display of a warrior's capabilities. Strength, agility, quick thinking, and an understanding of leverage were all crucial, skills directly transferable to the battlefield. Beyond wrestling, Vikings enjoyed other tests of raw strength. Stone lifting or stone throwing contests were common. Heavy natural stones, often of specific known weights or sizes, would be kept for this purpose. Warriors would compete to see who could lift the heaviest stone, or lift a particular stone to a certain height. Yeah, to the chest or shoulder, or throw it the farthest. These weren't just about brute force. Technique played a part too. The sagas mention testing stones at various homesteads, implying this was a regular way for men to measure their strength against one another. You can picture a group gathered around a massive stone, each warrior taking his turn, muscles straining, veins popping, urged on by his companions. "Come on, Harold. My grandmother lifted that stone last Yule. Put your back into it." Mock combat or weapons training, while perhaps blurring the line between pastime and practical preparation, would also have been a common sight. Practicing with swords, axes, and shields, perhaps with blunted weapons or through formalized drills, allowed warriors to keep their skills sharp even during peacetime. This could take the form of one-on-one sparring or group exercises. It was a way to burn off energy, build camaraderie, and ensure that when the call to arms came, they were ready. Our quirky tidbit is the mention in some sagas of aquatic sports or water contests. Vikings were, after all, people of the sea and fjords. These could include swimming races, diving competitions, and even a rather dangerous game that involved trying to dunk or hold an opponent underwater until they yielded. This last one, like sometimes called water play or sunglop, could easily turn serious and was not for the faint of heart. It shows their competitive spirit extended even to the water, and that their idea of fun could be pretty extreme. Imagine a Viking pool party, probably less about floating on inflatable swans and more about aggressive dunking contests. Historians and archaeologists still debate the exact nature and rules of many of these Viking Age sports and contests, as detailed descriptions are often lacking. While the sagas provide vivid accounts, they are literary sources written centuries later and may embellish or stylize these activities. The archaeological evidence, like potential wrestling stones or gaming areas, is often open to interpretation. How formalized were the rules for Glima in different regions? Were there leagues or just informal challenges? How common were serious injuries during these friendly contests? These are questions that require piecing together clues from various sources. These physical pastimes, from the strategic grips of Glima to the raw power of stone lifting, were more than just games. They were an integral part of Viking warrior culture, a way to demonstrate and cultivate the physical virtues of strength, agility, and resilience that were so highly esteemed. They provided an outlet for competitive urges, a means of social bonding, and a constant informal training ground that kept these Norsemen ready for the more serious challenges their often perilous world could throw at them. Even at rest, the Viking warrior was often still, in some way, preparing for action. The Viking homelands in Scandinavia are, as you know, no strangers to long, harsh winters. When the fjords froze over, the fields were blanketed in snow, and the days grew short and dark. Outdoor activities might seem limited. But the resourceful and resilient Vikings didn't just hibernate by the longhouse fire. They adapted their pastimes to the icy conditions, finding ways to turn the winter landscape itself into a playground for sport and practical movement. You can almost feel the crisp, cold air, hear the crunch of snow underfoot, and see the plumes of breath from Vikings enjoying their chilly diversions. Our mainstream historical fact is that skiing and ice skating were practiced in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, not just for practical transportation, but likely for recreation as well. Archaeological finds include preserved wooden skis, some dating back thousands of years, even predating the Viking Age, showing a long tradition in ice skates made from animal bones, typically the long metatarsal or metacarpal bones of horses or cattle. These weren't the sleek, metal-bladed skates we know today, but they were surprisingly effective. Imagine a Viking strapping on a pair of these bone skates. The undersides would be smoothed, and they might have been greased with animal fat to glide more easily over the ice. They didn't have sharp edges for pushing off like modern skates. Instead, the skater would likely use a pole or two, much like in cross-country skiing, to propel themselves across frozen lakes, rivers, or fjords. It would have been a fantastic way to travel quickly over frozen surfaces, whether for hunting, visiting neighboring farms, or simply for the exhilaration of speed. You can picture young Vikings racing each other across a vast expanse of ice. their laughter echoing in the still, cold air. Last one to the big ice fisher has to fetch more firewood and try not to fall in this time. Olaf, skiing too, had ancient roots in Scandinavia. The word ski itself comes from Old Norse skid, meaning split piece of wood. Viking Age skis were often of unequal length. A long gliding ski for one foot and a shorter, fur-clad kicker ski for the other, used to push off. This allowed for efficient travel over deep snow. While undoubtedly a vital means of hunting and traversing the winter landscape, it's easy to imagine skiing also being a source of enjoyment and even competition. Were there informal downhill races on particularly inviting slopes, or endurance challenges across snow-covered terrains? The sagas mention figures renowned for their skiing ability. Like the god Uller, who was associated with both skiing and archery, it's like the original biathlon, but probably with more bears involved. These winter sports required considerable skill, balance, and stamina. They weren't just casual fun. They were also excellent ways to maintain physical fitness during the less active agricultural months and to hone abilities that could be crucial for survival in a harsh northern climate. Being able to move swiftly and confidently over snow and ice was a valuable asset. Our quirky tidbit involves a slightly more boisterous and perhaps less common winter pastime, ice plays, or games on the ice that might have involved more than just skating. Some saga descriptions hint at activities that sound a bit like early forms of ice hockey or bandy, with players using sticks to hit an object across the ice. There are also mentions of something called nadlikur being played on ice, which was a rather rough ball game we might touch on later. But imagine the added challenge and hilarity of trying to play a contact sport on slippery bone skates. That wasn't a foul, he just hydroplaned into my shins. Happens to the best of us on these cursed horse bones. Archaeologists and historians still debate the exact techniques used for Viking Age bone skates and the extent to which skiing was a recreational activity versus a purely utilitarian one for the general population. How fast could you really go on bone skates? Were they primarily for short distances on flat ice, or could more ambitious journeys be undertaken with skiing? While its practical use is undeniable, how much time and opportunity did the average farmer Viking have for purely recreational skiing? The lines between necessity, sport, and play were often blurred in the ancient world. So, as the northern winter gripped the land, the Vikings didn't just retreat indoors, they embraced the cold, strapping on their bone skates and wooden skis, gliding and sliding through their frozen world. These activities provided not only essential means of travel and hunting, but also opportunities for exhilarating fun, friendly competition, and a unique way to connect with the stark beauty of their winter environment. It shows their adaptability and their ability to find joy and challenge even in the most unforgiving of seasons, turning the icy plains and snowy hills into their very own frosty playgrounds. When the weather outside was too frightful for even the hardiest Viking to enjoy skiing or ice skating, or during the long evenings after the day's work was done. Another, quieter but no less engaging pastime would often take place within the smoky confines of the longhouse craftsmanship, particularly carving in wood, bone, or antler. The Vikings were not just fierce warriors, they were also incredibly skilled artisans, and many individuals, both men and women, would have found pleasure and satisfaction in shaping raw materials into objects of beauty and utility. You can almost smell the scent of freshly worked wood, or hear the rhythmic scrape of a knife against bone as you picture a Viking absorbed in their craft. Our mainstream historical fact is that Viking Age art is renowned for its intricate and distinctive styles, characterized by complex animal interlace patterns, gripping beasts, and stylized mythological motifs, commonly found on a wide range of objects from jewelry and weapons to runestones and everyday items like tool handles, chests, and bedposts. Many of these items would have been crafted not by full-time specialist artisans, though those certainly existed, especially for high-status metalwork, but by ordinary people in their own homes during their leisure hours. It was a way to personalize their belongings, beautify their surroundings, and express their cultural identity. Imagine a warrior, his axe and shield set aside for the evening. He might pick up a piece of antler shed by a deer, or a block of fine-grained wood like maple or juniper. With a simple iron knife, an indispensable tool for any Viking, he would begin to carve. Perhaps he's decorating the handle of a new spoon for his wife, incising it with swirling knotwork, or maybe he's fashioning a small animal figurine for his child, a little wooden horse or a fearsome dragon. The work would be slow, meticulous, requiring patience and a steady hand. The firelight would flicker over his focused features as he carefully shaved away slivers of material, gradually revealing the form hidden within. Just a little more detail on this gripping beast's snout. He might mutter, and it'll be fierce enough to scare away bad dreams, or at least the neighbor's cat. This wasn't just idle whittling, though simple whittling for amusement was likely common too. The complex zoomorphic and geometric patterns seen in Viking art, like the bori, yelling, mammon, ringerike, and urne styles named after fine locations, demonstrate a sophisticated design sense and a mastery of technique. These styles evolved over time, but they all shared a love of intricate detail, flowing lines, and a dynamic, often fierce energy. To be able to replicate these patterns, even in a simplified form, on everyday objects would have been a source of pride and a mark of skill. Many everyday items, from wooden bowls to weaving tablets, show signs of such decorative carving, suggesting it was a widespread practice. Our quirky tidbit is the discovery of so-called practice pieces at some Viking Age sites. These are fragments of bone or wood covered in trial carvings, where an artisan seems to have been sketching out designs, practicing specific motifs, or trying different techniques before committing them to a finished object. It's like finding an ancient artist's sketchbook, offering a wonderful glimpse into the learning process and the development of their skills. Imagine a young Viking, not yet a master carver, patiently trying to get the perfect interlace on a piece of scrap bone. Perhaps with an older, more experienced carver offering a bit of advice. No, Eric. The dragon's tail should loop under that tendril. Not over. Are you trying to make it look like it's tripping over its own? Archaeologists and art historians still debate the full meaning and symbolism behind many Viking art motifs. While some elements clearly relate to Norse mythology like depictions of Odin, Thor, or scenes from Ragnarok, many of the abstract animal and interlace patterns are more enigmatic. Were they purely decorative? A love of complex pattern for its own sake? Or did they carry deeper apotropaic warding off evil or magical significance, imbuing the object with power or protection? The gripping beast motif, for example, where animals are shown biting and grasping themselves or parts of the frame, is particularly intriguing, and its exact meaning is much discussed. For the Viking at home, carving and other crafts like leatherworking or even simple textile work, though complex weaving was a major skill often associated with women, offered a productive and absorbing way to spend leisure time. It was a chance to create something beautiful or useful with one's own hands, to leave a personal mark on the material world. It fostered patience, concentration, and a deep appreciation for the properties of natural materials. As the shavings fell to the longhouse floor and a new form emerged under the carver's skilled touch, there would have been a quiet satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment that was a world away from the frenzy of battle or the hardships of a sea voyage. It was a different kind of conquest, the mastery of material and form. While carving intricate designs into wood and bone satisfied a Viking's creative urge, another, perhaps more personal form of at-home activity focused on their own appearance. Forget the stereotype of the unkempt, grimy barbarian. As we touched upon briefly earlier with the discovery of combs and tweezers, the Vikings, both men and women, actually dedicated a surprising amount of time and effort to personal grooming and elaborate adornment. Looking good, or at least looking distinct and well-maintained according to their own cultural standards, was clearly important. You can almost picture a Viking warrior, back from a long trip, finally able to enjoy the spa day comforts of home, a good wash, a hair combing session, and maybe selecting some favorite bling. Our mainstream historical fact is that personal grooming items such as combs made of antler, bone, or wood, tweezers, ear spoons, and even razors are common finds in Viking Age archaeological sites, particularly in graves. Sagas and historical accounts from other cultures who encountered them, like the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, also describe Vikings as being attentive to their cleanliness and appearance, at least by the standards of the time. They were known to bathe regularly, perhaps once a week, which was more frequent than many of their European contemporaries, comb their hair and beards, and take care of their clothes. This wasn't just about vanity. Cleanliness also promoted health, and a well-groomed appearance could be a sign of status and self-respect. Honestly, Ragnar, that beard looks like a family of particularly untidy squirrels has nested in it. Here, use my spare comb. And for Odin's sake, let's find that ear spoon before something actually does take up residence. Viking hairstyles could be quite elaborate, especially for warriors. Men often wore their hair long, sometimes braided in intricate patterns. Beards were also common and clearly a point of pride, often well-groomed, perhaps plaited or forked. Some sources even suggest that parts of the head might have been shaved, or that specific styles were fashionable at different times or in different regions. Women typically wore their hair long, often styled in complex knots or braids, sometimes covered with a headscarf or cap, especially for married women. Maintaining these hairstyles would have been a daily or regular activity, requiring time, effort, and perhaps the assistance of a family member. Imagine a warrior patiently having his long hair braided by his wife or daughter. A quiet, domestic moment. But grooming was just the start. The Vikings loved their bling. Our quirky tidbit here is the sheer quantity and variety of jewelry found in Viking contexts, worn by both men and women as signs of wealth, status, and personal identity. Men favored arm rings often given by chieftains as rewards for loyalty and service, finger rings, and neck rings or torques, as well as elaborate belt buckles and cloak pins. Women wore stunning necklaces made of glass beads, often imported and highly prized, amber, and silver, along with intricate brooches, especially oval or tortoise brooches used in pairs to fasten the straps of their apron-style dresses, finger rings, and pendants. This wasn't just costume jewelry, it was often made of precious metals like silver and gold, intricately worked with filigree, granulation, and inlaid stones. Selecting, wearing, and perhaps even trading these items would have been a part of their daily life and a way to express themselves. Does this silver wolf head arm ring go with my new tunic? Or is it too last raiding season, a warrior might ponder? The adornment wasn't limited to jewelry. Clothing itself, while made from practical materials like wool and linen, could be dyed in various colors, though bright. Lasting colors were often a sign of wealth, due to the expense of the dyes and decorated with embroidered bands or woven patterns. Even small everyday items like combs or needle cases were often beautifully decorated, as we saw with carving. This attention to detail suggests a strong aesthetic sense and a desire to beautify not just their surroundings, but themselves. Historians and archaeologists still debate the precise social meanings and regional variations of different types of Viking jewelry and dress. For example, did a particular style of brooch indicate a woman's marital status or regional origin? How strictly were certain types of adornment restricted to specific social classes? While grave goods provide a wealth of information, interpreting their full significance in a living society is complex. Were some pieces worn daily, while others were reserved for special occasions like feasts or religious ceremonies? So, when a Viking warrior was at home, unwinding didn't necessarily mean letting themselves go. Time would be spent maintaining their appearance, caring for their elaborate hairstyles, and selecting from their array of impressive jewelry. This concern for grooming and adornment paints a picture of a people who were not just rough warriors, but also individuals who valued beauty, status, and self-expression. It adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of their domestic lives, revealing a desire to look and feel good, even in the often harsh and demanding world of the Viking Age. It's a far cry from the purely brutish image, suggesting a culture that appreciated the finer details of personal presentation. We've explored the boisterous feasts, the strategic games, the captivating stories, the soul-stirring music, the physical contests, the winter sports, the intricate crafts, and the personal grooming that filled the leisure hours of Viking adults. But what about the younger members of the household Viking warriors? For all their fierceness abroad, were also parents, uncles, and aunts. Family life and the playful antics of children would have formed another significant, if perhaps less chronicled, aspect of unwinding at home, offering moments of tenderness, frustration, and simple joy. You're back in the longhouse, and amidst the adult activities, you can hear the lighter, more chaotic sounds of children. Viking society, like any other, included children, and their play and upbringing were integral to the household rhythm. Our mainstream historical fact is that Viking children, while expected to contribute to household chores from a relatively young age, also had time for play. Archaeological finds from Viking Age sites include a variety of toys, suggesting that childhood was recognized as a distinct phase of life with its own needs for amusement and learning through play. What kind of toys did Viking kids play with simplicity was often key, but imagination filled the gaps. Small wooden carvings of animals, horses, ships, perhaps even fearsome dragons, would have been common. Little toy weapons, like miniature wooden swords or axes, would have allowed boys and perhaps even some girls to emulate their warrior elders, engaging in mock battles that were both play and preparation for future roles. Think of a tiny Viking lad, brandishing a stick sword, fiercely defending his corner of the longhouse from an imaginary sea monster, or maybe just his slightly annoyed older sister. Fear me, for I am Thorkel the Mighty, and this is my fearsome, table leg of doom. Dolls, likely made from wood or cloth, would have been companions for girls, used in imaginative games of family and domestic life. Balls made of leather stuffed with hair or moss, spinning tops, and even simple board games or dice games, perhaps with less valuable stakes than the adults played for, would also have provided entertainment. The natural world itself was a playground. Children would have climbed trees, played by streams, and perhaps engaged in games of tag or hide-and-seek in the fields around their homes. It's a universal picture of childhood, just with a slightly more rugged Nordic backdrop. The interaction between adults and children during leisure time is harder to reconstruct with certainty from archaeology. But the sagas offer glimpses. Fathers might teach their sons the basics of wrestling or archery. Mothers and grandmothers would undoubtedly have told stories and sung lullabies. Our quirky tidbit is the mention in some sagas of adults engaging in playful, sometimes teasing, interactions with children, or even using children's perspectives in witty remarks. It suggests a level of affection and engagement that goes beyond mere tolerance. For instance, a warrior might jokingly defer to a child's wisdom in a lighthearted moment, or a child's innocent but cutting remark might be recorded as a source of amusement. Imagine a fierce Viking warrior being completely outmaneuvered in a debate by his 5-year-old daughter, much to the amusement of the rest of the longhouse. She has the cunning of Loki, that one, and the lungs of a berserker when she doesn't get her way. Historians and archaeologists still debate the precise nature of Viking childhood and the age at which children were considered to have transitioned to adulthood and its responsibilities. Was there a clear coming-of-age ceremony for most, or was it a more gradual process? How much did childhood experiences differ based on social class, for example, the child of a wealthy jarl versus the child of a thrall slave? While saga literature often focuses on the deeds of adults, the incidental details and archaeological finds of toys help us piece together a picture of young lives filled with both work and play. For a battle-hardened warrior, returning home to the sounds of his children laughing, or perhaps even participating in their simple games, could have offered a profound sense of peace and normalcy. It would be a reminder of what they fought for, what they sought to protect. Teaching a child to skip stones, telling them a familiar bedtime story about Thor and the giants, or simply watching them play with a carved wooden horse. These small, domestic moments would have provided a vital counterbalance to the harsh realities of raiding, trading, or farming in a challenging environment. These interactions offered a different kind of unwinding, a softening of the warrior spirit, a connection to the future through the next generation. The longhouse wasn't just a place for adult pastimes, it was a home, echoing with the full spectrum of family life, from the gravest adult concerns to the lightest of children's joys. The Viking world was not just populated by humans. Animals played a crucial and multifaceted role in their lives, serving as sources of food, labor, and materials. But also, importantly for our theme, as companions and even participants in certain forms of sport and leisure. When unwinding at home or in their local environment, Vikings would have interacted with their animals in ways that went beyond pure utility, sometimes blurring the lines between work, sport, and companionship. You can imagine the familiar presence of dogs around the longhouse, the pride in a well-bred horse, or the thrill of the hunt. Our mainstream historical fact is that domesticated animals like dogs, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were integral to Viking Age society. Dogs in particular were highly valued, not just as working animals for herding, hunting, or guarding, but also as loyal companions, and they are frequently found buried with their owners, suggesting a strong bond. Breeds varied, with some resembling modern Spitz-type dogs or elkhounds. Horses were also incredibly important, not only for riding and farm work, but also as status symbols. A good horse was a prized possession. You can picture a Viking warrior, back from a journey, taking time to groom his horse, or perhaps a dog eagerly greeting its master by the longhouse hearth, hoping for a scrap from the table or a good scratch behind the ears. Good boy, Fang. Did you keep those pesky wolves away from the chickens while I was gone? Or were you too busy napping by the fire again? Hunting, while often a necessity for supplementing the diet, could also be pursued as a sport by those with the time and resources. Tracking deer, wild boar, or game birds in the forests and fells would have tested a warrior's skills in archery, spear throwing, and woodcraft, returning from a successful hunt. Even if it was more for sport than survival on that particular day, would bring prestige and provide an occasion for feasting. Falconry, the art of hunting with trained birds of prey, was also known in Viking Age Scandinavia, though it was likely an elite pastime, given the time and skill required to train and maintain the birds. Imagine a chieftain, a hawk perched on his gloved fist, scanning the horizon for prey, a potent symbol of power and mastery over nature. Now for a quirky and somewhat more controversial tidbit. The sagas mention a sport known as hestavig, or horse fighting. This involved two stallions, often specially bred and trained for aggression, being pitted against each other, incited by their owners and a surrounding crowd of spectators who would bet on the outcome. The horses would bite, kick, and rear, and the fight would continue until one was driven off, seriously injured, or sometimes even killed. While it may seem brutal to modern sensibilities, and it certainly was, it was apparently a popular form of entertainment in Iceland and Norway during the Viking Age. It was a spectacle, a chance for gambling, and a way for owners to display the prowess and fighting spirit of their prize stallions. This was definitely not a gentle pursuit, and it highlights how Viking ideas of fun could be quite different from our own. My stallion, Snowmane, will make short work of your pathetic nag. Gunner, I wager my new shield on it. Archaeologists and historians still debate the prevalence and social acceptance of more brutal animal sports like horse fighting or bear baiting, which also may have occurred, though evidence is less direct. Were these widespread and common, or more localized and sporadic? How did they reconcile such activities with what often seems to be a respectful, if utilitarian, relationship with their domesticated animals, particularly dogs and horses found in honored burials. It's a complex area, reflecting a worldview where animals were both companions and commodities, and where notions of entertainment could encompass a degree of violence that we would find shocking today. Beyond these more sporting interactions, simple companionship with animals would have been a part of daily life. A cat, also present in the Viking world, valued for pest control, might curl up by the fire. Children might play with puppies or kittens. The rhythms of animal husbandry, feeding, milking, shearing, were daily realities. But within those tasks, bonds of affection and familiarity would undoubtedly form. The presence of animals in and around the longhouse would have contributed to the overall atmosphere, a constant reminder of the interconnectedness of humans and the natural world in Viking Age Scandinavia. For a warrior at home, the nuzzle of a trusted dog or the strength of a fine horse could be a source of comfort, pride, and a different kind of connection, a respite from the world of human conflict and ambition. We've journeyed through a fascinating array of Viking pastimes, from the boisterous feasting and sharp-witted board games in the longhouse to the rugged outdoor sports and intricate crafts. Many of these activities, while providing leisure, also reflected or honed skills valuable in their often harsh world. Strategic thinking, physical prowess, storytelling, and craftsmanship. But what about the quieter, perhaps more domestic and less warrior-like pursuits? Did Viking warriors, when at home, ever engage in activities that we might consider more mundanely peaceful, like tending a small garden or other gentle toils that offered a different kind of respite? You're now looking beyond the immediate hustle of the longhouse, perhaps to a small, enclosed patch of land nearby. While large-scale agriculture, grains like barley and rye, and animal husbandry, was the backbone of their subsistence and a lot of hard work. There's evidence to suggest that smaller-scale cultivation of vegetables and herbs also took place, often tended by the women of the household, but perhaps also offering a quiet, focused activity for anyone. This is our mainstream historical fact. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age sites includes preserved seeds and plant remains of cultivated vegetables such as cabbages, peas, beans, onions, and various herbs like dill, coriander, and hops used for brewing ale. These would have been grown in small kitchen gardens or herb plots near the home, supplementing their diet and providing flavorings and medicinal plants. While tilling the main fields was arduous labor, tending a small kitchen garden could have been a more contemplative pastime for some. Imagine carefully weeding a patch of herbs, checking on the progress of the pea vines, or harvesting pungent onions. It's a connection to the earth, a quiet act of nurturing that provides a direct, tangible reward. For a warrior accustomed to the uncertainties of voyages and battles, the predictable cycle of planting and harvesting, even on a small scale, might have offered a sense of grounding and peace. It's probably not what first springs to mind when you think Viking warrior hobby, but it's a plausible part of their domestic landscape. Right, that raiding trip was a bit stressful. Think I'll go spend an hour communing with my cabbages. They're much less likely to try and cleave my skull. Beyond the strictly utilitarian, were there other gentle pursuits? What about simply enjoying the beauty of their surroundings? The Scandinavian landscapes, though often rugged, are also stunningly beautiful. Did Vikings take quiet walks in the woods when not hunting, admire a sunset over a fjord, or simply sit and appreciate the changing seasons? The sagas and poetry are full of vivid descriptions of nature, suggesting a deep awareness and appreciation of their environment. This appreciation might not always translate into a pastime in the active sense, but moments of quiet contemplation of the natural world could certainly have been a form of mental unwinding. Our quirky tidbit here relates to the collection of wild resources. While often a necessity, foraging for wild berries, nuts, mushrooms, and edible plants could also have a leisurely aspect, especially if undertaken in good company or in a particularly abundant and pleasant location. It's a bit like people today who enjoy going apple picking or foraging for wild garlic. It's partly about the produce, but also about the experience of being outdoors and the satisfaction of finding nature's bounty. Imagine a group of Viking women and children, and perhaps even some men not otherwise occupied, heading out on a sunny autumn day to gather berries for making jams or flavoring mead. Their laughter and chatter filling the air. Look at this patch of cloudberries. Enough here to make grandmother's special Yule cordial. If young Torsten doesn't eat them all first. Archaeologists and paleobotanists still debate the full range and dietary significance of cultivated versus wild plant resources in the Viking Age diet, and how this varied regionally and socially. For example, how much effort was put into actively cultivating herbs versus simply gathering wild ones? Were there more pleasure gardens for aesthetic enjoyment, or were all cultivated plots strictly for food and utility? Evidence for purely ornamental gardening is scarce for this period in Scandinavia. Unlike in, say, contemporary Islamic Spain or later medieval Europe, the Viking approach to their immediate green surroundings was likely overwhelmingly practical. But beauty and utility are not always mutually exclusive. So, while the image of a Viking warrior gently tending a rose garden might be a stretch too far, it's important to remember the context of their daily lives. Their world was deeply agrarian, even for those who went on raids. The rhythm of the seasons, the connection to the land, the tasks of growing and gathering food were fundamental. Within these quiet toils, there would have been moments of satisfaction, peace, and a different kind of engagement with the world than that found in battle or on long sea voyages. These less dramatic, perhaps more mundane activities provided a necessary balance, grounding them in the cycles of home and hearth, and offering a respite that was as vital for their well-being as any boisterous feast or challenging game. As our exploration of Viking pastimes at home draws to a close, we've journeyed far from the stereotypical image of the relentlessly raiding warrior. We've seen them in their longhouses, warmed by the hearth, engaging in boisterous feasts and sharp-witted verbal duels. We've watched them hunched in concentration over strategic board games like Hnefatafel, and heard the rattle of dice in games of chance. We've listened to the captivating voices of storytellers spinning sagas of gods and heroes, and the gentler notes of lyres and flutes. We've witnessed their strength in friendly wrestling matches and stone-lifting contests, their joy in winter sports on ice and snow, their creativity in intricate carvings, and their surprising dedication to personal grooming and adornment. We've even caught glimpses of family life, children's play, their connection with animals, and the quieter rhythms of tending the land. What does all this tell us? Our mainstream historical fact for this concluding section is that the leisure activities of the Vikings reveal a complex and multifaceted culture, one that valued not only martial prowess and exploration, but also intellectual skill, artistic expression, social bonds, and a deep connection to their traditions and environment. Their pastimes were not just frivolous diversions, they were integral to their identity, their social structure, and their worldview. They helped to transmit cultural values, reinforce social hierarchies, hone useful skills, and provide necessary outlets for creativity, competition, and relaxation. The spirit of competition, for instance, ran deep. Whether it was in a physical contest, a board game, or a verbal duel. But this was often balanced by a strong sense of community and hospitality, seen in the importance of feasting and shared storytelling. Their love for intricate patterns, evident in their carvings and jewelry, speaks to a sophisticated aesthetic sense. Their endurance in sports and their ingenuity in adapting to their environment, like with skiing or bone ice skates, highlight their resilience and resourcefulness. Even their grooming habits point to a people who took pride in their presentation and perhaps a certain dandyish flair. It's a far richer picture than just horned helmets and axes, and remember, the horned helmets are mostly a myth. So, next time someone calls you a Viking just because you enjoy a good board game and have an impressive beard, you might think, tell them they're only scratching the surface of true Norse leisure. Our quirky tidbit is to consider how many of these pastimes had a practical, skill-honing aspect, even when pursued for pleasure. Board games sharpen strategic thinking useful in warfare or trade. Wrestling and strength contests maintained physical fitness. Carving could produce not just beautiful objects, but also essential tools or repairs. Storytelling preserved history and taught moral lessons. Even the boasting at feasts could be a way of building a reputation that might be useful in future alliances or conflicts. For the Vikings, the line between leisure and practical life skills was often delightfully blurred. It's like your relaxing hobby of assembling incredibly complex Lego sets actually makes you a better engineer. Win-win. Historians and archaeologists continue to piece together the full tapestry of Viking Age leisure, drawing on diverse sources like the sagas, Eddic poetry, archaeological finds, runic inscriptions, and accounts from other cultures. There are still many unanswered questions and areas of debate. For example, how much did leisure activities vary between different social classes? A powerful jarl versus a free farmer versus a thrall? How did Christianization, towards the end of the Viking Age, impact traditional pastimes and storytelling traditions? The picture is constantly being refined as new discoveries are made and new interpretations are offered. The legacy of these Viking pastimes, however, is not just a matter of historical curiosity. Some, like certain forms of Scandinavian folk music or traditional crafts, show continuity. The enduring popularity of Norse mythology in modern books, films, and games speaks to the power of those ancient stories. Even the spirit of adventurous exploration and resilience can be seen as a kind of cultural echo. Their leisure activities, from the fiercely competitive to the quietly creative, reveal a people who knew how to live fully, embracing both the challenges and the joys of their world. They show us that even the most formidable warriors need their downtime, and that the ways they chose to spend it can tell us as much about them, if not more, than their exploits in battle. As the fire in the longhouse of your imagination burns low, and the tales of Viking leisure settle in your mind, let the image be not just of the axe, but of the game piece, the carving knife, the storyteller's gesture, the shared drinking horn. These were the tools of their unwinding, the expressions of their humanity when they were home, among their own. It's a reminder that every culture, no matter how renowned for one particular aspect, is a rich and complex whole, with layers of daily life, joy, and creativity waiting to be discovered. May your own pastimes bring you as much engagement and satisfaction as theirs clearly did. And now, as the night deepens and the world outside grows still, allow the echoes of the Viking longhouse, the laughter, the songs, the stories, the clatter of game pieces to fade gently. The warriors are at rest, their axes set aside, their minds engaged in other, more peaceful conquests. Let this vision of a more complete, more human Viking age bring a sense of comfort and peace to your own rest. May your dreams be filled with good fellowship and a warm hearth, and may your slumber be as deep and restorative as that of a Norseman safe at home after a long journey.